What if I told you one of the most powerful tools to build and scale your business was actually talking to yourself? I'm not joking. And today we sat down with my best friend who is an absolute savage when it comes to understanding the human mind and how to utilize it to your benefit to give you the results that you desire, the dreams that you look for, and to constantly flex that muscle. So we sit down in person in my loft with my best friend, TJ, who is an absolute master at coaching and helping people achieve the results in their life. And we unpacked a ton. I'd have a notebook ready. I'd have your brain ready. I'd have this one to re-listen to a few times because every time TJ opens his mouth, my entire life shifts. And we covered a range of topics all around your mind and how to master your mind to be able to achieve the results that you desire. We talk about the unconscious and conscious mind, how our emotions are processed separate than logic to understand them to make better decisions, on how often we fall into the trap of accepting narratives as concrete truths without questioning them, how our beliefs and morals are shaped, how you can change your beliefs and your identity at any time, how talking to yourself can help build rapport with your unconscious mind, how in this lens, a word that we throw around often like personal development, but really it's growth and perspective shifting, is how important it is to understand the power of our mind in that, and how our unconscious knows and wants to serve us at the highest level, but needs clear instructions, recognizing the duality of our mind and how to utilize it to our benefit, how awareness of our beliefs is the first step to change, how identity shifts are crucial for our personal growth, our business growth, and the results that we want, which you've heard me echo a ton of, like, you don't have the business you want because you haven't become the person to run it, like our dear friend Alex Sharfin says, but how to utilize that as an invitation, how our language plays a significant role in shaping the way that we see the world, which leads to our actions and behaviors, which either get us close to results or further away from them, some empowering questions and his frameworks to get into massive self-discovery to make instantaneously shifts, like instantaneous shifts, the 4 stages of competence, of us understanding where we are in the process and where to focus our time and energy, whether we're trying to get more clients or show up more consistently or communicate better, how gratitude practices can rewire our reticular activating system, leading to more, how negatives in language can hinder our progress, how understanding NLP, or what we call neuro-linguistic programming, can help with your growth. And literally in front of me, I have like 6 more notes of pages, but let me just put a bow on this one. If you've ever wondered how to get to the next level, to be in the driver's seat of your life, and to get your entire body, your mind, your environment, and your ecosystem to conspire to get you those results and have a clear path to get there, this podcast is for you. And so there's so much, and there's so much note, weight, and nuggets, and we're going to do an episode 2 and an episode 3, but I want to give you the first bite because I left this one with notes, and he shared this with my clients and people at our events, and their lives drastically changed with the same information that he shared with this show. And so without further ado, this intro has been long enough. Let's get into the episode. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Mind of George show. If you're watching this, I can't like, hey, here, who's the guest today? He's sitting next to me, but we're doing comfy. We should have done this in our pajamas, but we are in my bedroom because I decided to set up a studio because this is my best friend, my neighbor who lives up the street, but I'm really, really excited. So just consider this like a cozy, comfortable conversation and casual, which truthfully is how we talk anyways. So today, our guest is my incredible friend, TJ Fry. You'll get to know him, love him, as everybody in our environment that's met him. He speaks at almost all of our events. So I'm kind of holding a line that he speaks at all of them because he has this really uncanny ability to break your brain in the best way possible, but then also empower you to put the pieces back together. So TJ is my brother in faith, my best friend. Also, how do I put this? He's the one man in my life that every time he speaks, I get challenged to think differently. And he is a geek and a nerd about understanding the brain, how it supports us, how we can use it for our benefit, understanding the difference between conscious and unconscious mind, and basically how to use the power of our mind to work in our benefit to create the results and the things that we want in our life. He coaches people, he guides people. He has this incredible toolbox of, let's call it technology, because that's what it is, of technology to help people stand in their power, break through limitations and beliefs, and truthfully live a life in deep alignment. And so without further ado, TJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. Super glad to be here.
Yeah. And he out cowboys me like 100 to 1. I keep my cowboy hat in storage. I only whip it out occasionally, but I do wear the boots. But TJ is just like my Montana man best friend and also my get out of jail free card. I'm at his house like every couple of days. I'm like, hey, I need this. Can I borrow this? Can you help me with this? You have a solution for this. Can you help me get my car out of this? And so he's also an incredible man, an incredible father.
That's what we do for each other.
An incredible husband. And and actually some of our best conversations have happened in those moments.
Yeah.
I like to anecdotally say this, like TJ is also the man who rebaptized me as I gave my life to Jesus. And a lot of you that listen to the show know that I just posted my testimony podcast and I talked about TJ. That is this TJ. But I also love TJ's poignant delivery and the ability
That's a nice way to say it.
Yeah, right?
Poignant is very generous. Blunt is probably what my wife would say, but
but Danny's also blunt too.
She is.
Yeah,
I think that's why she dislikes it.
Yeah. And I'm like, watching you two dance together is also like comically humorous to where I feel like when I'm with them, I'm like, I'm just going to get my popcorn and witness this magic happening. And my favorite thing though is when Danny uses you on you.
Oh yeah, it drives me crazy, and simultaneously, it's also a beautiful thing too because it helps me understand what I am providing for other people. So there's value in it because it's uncomfortable. Whereas you like to say it tickles.
Yeah, oh, it tickles.
Yeah, so it's she does a really good job of doing that to me. There's definitely times when I'm like, I don't need to be. No, not now. So but she does a wonderful job reflecting me to me.
Oh yeah, and the one that I love, because she also fills me in on all this, but I love this one question that we will definitely share in this episode. That it tends to be, and it's the same for me too. It's like when I coach my partner or someone in my life, and then a couple weeks later, I'm in a moment, and they're like, "Oh, really? Well, when did?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's what it feels like."
Yeah.
Oh, got it. Like taking my own medicine. So yeah, I'll never forget. TJ and I were in my driveway at the previous house. I think this was post car accident because we had like a 5-car pile up in my driveway.
Yeah.
I was like, TJ, come help me get the truck out. And then he hit the car. We had other cars hit. And then we were ice breaking and bully barring the driveway for like 9 inches of ice trying to get it out. And then he fell and ate crap. I fell and ate crap. And then I ended up on my knees in tears because you spoke truth into me. So I'll say poignant delivery because what I feel like is that when you speak, I know that underneath it all is the best intention and the best values. And you're kind of like, can we get rid of the symptoms and get right to the root? And it comes with such this loving delivery. So for everybody listening to this, when TJ speaks and he speaks at my events and when we have conversations, like I'll go to his house for 5 minutes and then 3.5 hours later I leave. And typically it's Branson being like, Dad, can we go? Because we end up in these mind-bending conversations, but then I download and I have to take notes. I'm like, God, that really landed. That really landed. And so my invitation for everybody on this one is to find a notepad or a pen and paper, or allow yourself space to download what comes, because we have a breadth of topics to get into. And so I want to kind of start right now because this is the one that I love watching you do in person. And the way that you frame it is like, does everybody know you have an unconscious mind?
Sure.
And so can you unpack that for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I'll do here is a little different than what I would do in an in-person event. But what I would do is I'll tell everybody listening, you have an unconscious mind. Well, what does that mean? Quite frankly, most of us assume unconscious being knocked out, right? Like having a head injury. At least that's what you and I think. If I fell off a horse or fell skiing or whatever it was, right? The reality here, which is funny, I say fell off a horse because we were just talking about horses, but I'm not a horse guy. I should be completely upfront about that. Anyhow, the reality is that our conscious mind is, if you think about those pictures of a glacier floating in water, our conscious mind is the portion that's above the water. And that's roughly, I would argue, 10%. Now, really, the number is insignificant. It's the idea and the concept that matters. And your unconscious mind is the portion underneath the water. Well, how do we know that? We know that it's significantly larger and that it's incredibly important. Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand what the mind is and where it exists. And so if we think about, coming from a scientific family, my father was a physician, surgeon to be specific. And so from a scientific family, I grew up very much valuing science. And so I also went to Catholic school. I'm a recovering Catholic. So, I mean, I have this this beautiful blend of both that I'm very grateful for, of faith and science. I think they're not exclusionary. They can both work together. So the conscious mind exists within our frontal lobe. So that's the front part of our brains as human beings. It's what a big portion of what makes us special as humans. And that's where we process data, right? That's where we think. That's where egoically we live. Like you as George, me as TJ, the listeners as themselves. That's where we exist. That consists of our egoic self. That consists of logic, rationale, it's incredible all the things that take place in the frontal lobe. Now that's conscious thinking. Generally, what I would do at an in-person event is I would then ask, well, how many people have had to think consciously about loving your spouse, loving your children, loving your family, right? Have you thought about being angry? And most people recognize that as like, oh no, I've never had to think of an emotion. Well, we know that the unconscious mind is the exclusive domain of emotions. And we know that because on an EEG, we can actually see the portions of the brain that light up are like the hippocampus and the back part of the brain. It's not the frontal lobe. And so what we see is that emotion exists in a different part of the mind than our logic, rationale, and egoic selves live. So we know there's a separation. When you ask someone to solve a math problem, that's front of the brain, that's conscious. But if you ask somebody how many degrees are in a right angle, that comes up from a different place. So once you've learned something, it stores itself in a different part of the mind, which I submit is the unconscious mind. So a couple more examples, right? These are pretty simple ones. If you've ever had like a paper cut or put a Band-Aid on, or, whatever it is, like an injury, right? You don't logically have to think to heal yourself. You don't control you can, but you don't just walk around every day thinking I have to breathe in, I have to breathe out, right? I have to pump blood, I have to digest this food. Like all the things that you do automatically are controlled by something within your brain. And again, I submit that that's the unconscious mind, because we know that the neurons have to fire to control your muscles and control your body. And so we know that that has to be controlled by something. And so again, my submission and my suggestion is that you recognize that as the unconscious mind, which means it's incredibly powerful. And it's just the operating system running in the background. Your mind, your conscious mind, I like to present as an app on that operating system, meaning that it's incredibly powerful. It might be the one that you use all the time. Like for you and I, it's probably text messages. Like that's, the text app, right? That's what we use constantly, whatever that app may be for you. But then the operating system allows you to do everything else, and it's running everything in the background. You never really see it unless you're like a developer. And that's kind of how I consider myself, is I like to dig into things and see what I can figure out and how I can dissect and figure out what's going on underneath the surface. So assuming that we agree that we all have a conscious and unconscious mind, then the next question logically is, well, what does it do and what are its jobs? And I'd submit a few different options or a few different suggestions. Number one, and I believe this is first and foremost, is it controls the body, which means that, yes, like, can you consciously slow your heartbeat, change your breathing? Yes, absolutely. And simultaneously, you're not doing that all the time. So it controls the body, which also means that it has a blueprint of the body in its current state, as well as a blueprint of the body in perfect health. And so when you feel intuitively like I'm thirsty, or I should eat more protein, or maybe I should not eat that bag of garbage. Whatever it is, like when you feel those desires to have certain foods or to fuel yourself with a certain way, you're getting that from somewhere. That's not coming out of nowhere. And so my submission again is that it's something that your unconscious mind presents you and tells you what it is that your body needs. Intuition, intuitively, we sense things all the time. That's also present within the unconscious mind. And we know that consciously we don't generally think like, I'm getting something here. Like, where's it coming from? No, that's a feeling. So emotions, again, exist only within the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind, if we think about it, it helps me to think about it as a young child. It wants to serve. It's like a good dog. It wants you to be happy. It wants to serve you. However, it needs clear instructions to follow. It does not do well. It is symbolic as well, meaning that it takes symbols, which is why I think it's very important to be, ironically, to be conscious and aware of what content we consume. I don't watch horror films. I generally am very careful about the music that I listen to, because I want to protect myself from certain messages and symbols and whatnot getting into my unconscious mind, because it receives everything. And I do believe that because it's symbolic and because it's incredibly powerful and receptive, it's very important to maximize the things that we want to receive and minimize the things that we want to reject. And so that's a conscious process, which is interesting because they work together. One note I'd make too. So the unconscious mind, while it is part of your mind, it is effectively separate. And so the three stages in life, which, and again, a lot of this is generalization, and I think it's more the concept that's important rather than the specific numbers. But the three stages in life that are largely agreed upon by developmental scientists and experts are that the first 7 years of life are, and I like to break it down a little differently, but the first 7 years of life are one, the next 7 years of life, so 8 to 14, are a second phase, and then the third phase being 15 to 21. Now, that first phase in life, basically, as a human being, you're learning about the world around you. The second phase, you're learning how you can fit into the world around you. And the third phase, you're learning who you are and how to affect the world around you. And so those are, again, very, very simplified ways to break it down. And how does the unconscious play into that? Well, what ultimately happens is, if you think about an infant, I've got about a 1-year-old daughter, and I love watching her because she doesn't speak English. So if you think about how does one think without language, right? So NLP being something that I'm big in and certified in and trained in, which is neuro-linguistic programming, for those of you that are unaware, and linguistic being our middle name, words are very, very important to us. That said, if you don't know words, how does one think? And so what I've come to think about this at this point is that the integration of the conscious and unconscious mind means that effectively one is, before language becomes a possibility, one is thinking in emotion, meaning that the conscious and unconscious minds are connected intrinsically. And so as a very young person, as an infant, as a toddler, you can see the reactions to situations. You can see the immediate emotional shift. I mean, when my daughter's uncomfortable, like, she lets us know, but then I pick her up and she's just instantly in this other emotion. So she's communicating with emotions instead of language, and she's thinking in emotions. It's beautiful. And most of us think in English or Spanish or whatever language it is that we opt to think in. So recognizing that that's taking place in that early stage of life before you really learn language. And then as you learn language, what we realize is that suddenly that means that we're actually separating, we're disintegrating our conscious and unconscious minds. And so over time, then you go to school and you start being taught. I could have a whole conversation on school and indoctrination and all that we won't get into now. But as you learn our social status, as you learn our social norms in society and how to exist, and basically how our world works as human beings, most of us in the West subscribe to the notion that you need to get a good job. You need to be a productive member of society. I'm not commenting on male versus female or any of that, but like the idea being like there is a role for you to take place in life. And usually that involves a career, male or female, doesn't matter. And so if the career and or like raising children, having a family is all part of that, that's fine. But you have a job to do as a person. And so because those things happen, we consciously accept these truths. Well, what do we call those truths? Well, we call those truths our morals. Now, I'm not talking about morals that we believe in necessarily right or wrong as a society, like, be kind to others, be accepting, be loving. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about the fundamental truths that we accept to be true. So our unconscious mind is also where that's where we store our morality. But the morality is not necessarily what everyone else thinks is moral. It's the morals that you were taught, and crucially, it's the morals that you accepted. And so our unconscious mind takes these morals. It takes things like beliefs. We all know what limiting beliefs are and how those can affect us, right? So if we believe we're not worthy or not good enough, that can greatly impact our lives in a lot of very profound ways. It takes our core values, for example, right? So some of my core values, loyalty, freedom, love, like I have all these, we all have different ones and they're stacked in a hierarchy. Well, where did those come from? Well, they came from our unconscious mind accepting this morality to be true. And if you were taught as a young person, for example, that, you had a rough life, right? I know you had a rough early part of your life. And so someone like yourself that had maybe not gone through the transformation that you had gone through could potentially have a morality that includes survival at any cost. Now, you can't criticize that person. It's an understandable moral to have deeply installed within their unconscious. And yet that could also mean that they're willing to hurt others or to steal or to do things that socially we might consider unacceptable. And yet that's only because they accepted the moral that survival was more important than, say, honesty or love or whatever it is, right? So my belief is that, number one, people are doing the best they can with the tools that they have. And that helps me look at conversations with people I disagree with much differently, and it's much easier to have now. And number two, I also believe that I want to be careful about how I say this because I want to say it with intention. So people are doing the best they can with what they have, and simultaneously I respect their model of the world regardless, and that has nothing to do, to use your word, irregardless. I have to give you a hard time about that.
Word.
You did a good job. You're doing great. I just have to throw it back. But regardless of whether I agree with it or not, right? So I can disagree with somebody on anything, especially politics, which is like, oh my God, that's dangerous, right? But if I disagree with someone, I can still respect your model of the world. And so understanding the neurological processes that the unconscious mind plays a crucial role in has helped me become far less argumentative, far more accepting, and it's helped me stand on my own principles. I've had an amazing conversation recently with a mutual friend of ours, who called herself a chameleon, or labeled herself a chameleon, which I actually think it can be good or bad given the context of the conversation, right? If we're talking about a person running for office who's maybe like using different accents in different environments, who shall remain nameless. But point being, that's chameleon-esque because you're trying to build rapport with certain people. And while I respect that model of the world, probably not a good look if there's a benefit, maybe a nefarious benefit for you doing it. That said, if there's not necessarily a benefit for you doing it, there is a value in being able to blend in and connect with people that you may or may not have a deep rapport with already. So it can be good and bad, but she refers to herself as a chameleon. And we had a wonderful conversation about what that actually means. And because unconsciously we're receiving messages from other people, the ability to be a chameleon can actually be a pretty profound one, because your ability to connect with others is really what that stems from. And because I considered myself a chameleon, I mean, Dave Chappelle has a great joke about it where he's like, somebody would start talking like this and then he'd be like, hey, how you doing? You're like, wait a minute, I don't talk like that. Why did I do that? Well, largely it's because our unconscious mind wants to feel comfortable. When you build that rapport with somebody, you can connect with them. And because I used to do that, once I accepted that I respect the model of the world of other people around me without agreeing with them, I no longer felt the need to have this deep rapport all the time. It was okay for me to be uncomfortable and for someone to disagree with someone, or to have someone disagree with me. And so what that turned into was me accepting my beliefs truly, deeply, profoundly, and fully, integrating them into my own being, and then being able to use the parlance of our times, stand on business when having a conversation with somebody that I disagree with. And so the chameleon element went away on the negative portion, and yet I still retain the ability to connect with others and build rapport quickly. So a lot said there. I think ultimately, to understand the unconscious mind, the best way to begin to connect with it is to simply, and this is where people laugh at me, but start talking to yourself.
Yep.
you know? And I mean, sometimes I do it out loud when I'm by myself. I generally don't like walk into a public area and start like, hey, thanks, unconscious mind. Like I'm not crazy about it. However, what I do is I will sit with myself. So whether that's during meditation or whether, you know, if I'm hiking in the mountains or if I'm by myself in the truck or whatever it is, speaking to my unconscious mind, and then crucially, trusting and listening to the answers that come back. That's where a lot of people get hung up, because they start to consciously process those answers. Oh, what does this mean? So if you were to ask yourself, why am I afraid of spiders? What's the reason? What's the purpose for me to be afraid of spiders? And if something pops up to you immediately, because that's how our unconscious mind works. And when I say if, I mean when, because that's how it works. And you analyze that answer, it's like, oh, it's because I got bitten by one at a young age. Okay, well, if you start analyzing that as consciously analyzing it and breaking it down, I would offer that you're doing it wrong, because your unconscious mind, again, is like a little child. You know, that like Branson, right? Your son. And so sometimes I'll hear him say things to you where it's just like, oh, that cut deep. There's truth to that. Like there was no filter. Like that's the old, like, does this make me look fat? And the kid's like, yes. Right. So our unconscious mind is like that. And if we trust it and love it and show it that we trust it and love it and accept the feedback that it gives us, it's going to be more willing. It's going to build rapport and trust us as well. So speaking with one's unconscious mind is a beautiful way to start to build that relationship with it. So we all have unconscious minds. They're incredibly powerful. And ultimately, I think there's so much that you can do with it. And how do you benefit from it? How do you work with it? So many different ways.
Yeah. Okay. So everybody, thanks for coming to TJ's TED Talk. That was an entire presentation, which I love. And I want to hit some points and kind of tie it together. So I know you very well. We talk about this. This is what TJ and I talk like off camera 24/7.
Yeah.
Hey, I need to borrow some firewood. Great. Can we talk about this? Yeah, of course. Right. Hey, we're going for a drive. Can we talk about this? Hey, I need help moving a storage unit. These are the conversations that happen. But I think for me to paraphrase a lot of this for everybody listening, I think the one overarching thing that I would say, and I love that you say this, is that I think the umbrella over all of this is that all too often the thing that we both see as coaches and I see as entrepreneurs, and especially with myself, is that I fell into the trap most of my life accepting the narrative that was installed in me as hard, concrete truth without ever challenging that based on, paradigm development and the life that I lived and all those parts. Right. And so I think for all of us, like everybody listening, it doesn't matter which bucket you look at this in, of like, oh, well, I have the relationship I have because that's all I deserve, or my business can't get past this level because that's just the highest I can make it, or I'm not good at this, so I'm not going to try. Right. It's anywhere where you have, let's call it, internal dialogue that is keeping you in the same place, and it's accepted and believed as concrete, like it cannot change.
Yeah. So I want to touch on this, if it's okay, real quick. So there's absolutely this belief currently within society. You hear people say it all the time. I know who I am. Right? How many times have we heard that? I think this is a fascinating conversation, because I completely agree with you in that this seems to be like a normal thing. And especially, like, for me, I notice this a lot with women.
Yeah.
Because I think it's encouraged, which I would argue is a good thing. I think that encouraging people, male or female, to be comfortable with who they believe themselves to be with themselves, I think is it's beautiful. And I'm glad that that's becoming normal. However, the idea that you are this way forever, you were born this way, you'll live this way, you'll die this way, is hogwash.
Yeah.
So what I submit is, and I think this is far more pleasant to wrap my head around, is that, okay, you currently are one specific way. Great. I agree with that. You also have the ability to change the way that you are, right? So, okay, this is who you are right now in this moment. I can accept that and I can agree with that. Doesn't it provide you more choice, more flexibility, more freedom, and more you, if you will? It gives you more ability to do whatever you want in life, to be able to know and accept that you can change who you are right now into something different. Notice I'm saying different, not better or worse.
Different.
Right? but it's about flexibility. It's about change.
Yeah.
And so, I constantly hear this. There's some women in my life that have been absolutely captured by this idea of like, oh, this is who I am. If you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. Like, well, that's garbage. I just can't subscribe to that. I do believe that, like, yes, we all have challenges, but here's the thing. If your worst is consistent, then maybe you're the common denominator.
Mm-hmm.
I like to throw Taylor Swift under the bus in this conversation, because it's like, if you've been writing these same songs for 20 years about dating terrible guys, like, look in the mirror.
Yeah.
All right. Like, yeah, there's a lot of not great men out there. You're still the one choosing them. Yeah. All right. So the argument there is like, you actually have the power to be able to shift your identity should you so choose.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to umbrella and tie this together. And I'm actually really glad you added that point, because, you know, like, my background, and you acknowledge this, right? Like, I share my story pretty openly, but I had that survival view of the world, even in business, right? Like, the reason I made millions of dollars wasn't because I was like, oh, I'm going to go impact the world. Like, I was convinced when I had $1 million in my bank account that I was broke. Like, that was my baseline. I was broke. And I mean, like, penny pinching, like, I would have people in my life that didn't have money, that had a couple $1,000s a month. And I'm like, I can't pay for dinner. I can't, because I had so much scarcity from having no needs met as a kid, or living in survival, or being homeless, or what all those cases were. Right. And it was this solid view. So the reason I bring this up and that umbrella goes over it is because I think to summarize TJ's keynote at the beginning of this, which I'm saying is incredible. Like, everybody should listen to that again, because there's so much depth inside of it. Is that the first step, I think, is understanding this umbrella, that how we see the world, how we show up in the world, is not concrete. It can be flexible, it can be changed, but the first step of it is understanding that there's potentially, or I would say this, there's a driver and a co-driver in the car. There's a driver and a navigator. And like, the way that I break this down, and that's like coached into me, is that like, our conscious mind is in the driver's seat when we are intentionally putting it there. But when we're unaware, our unconscious mind is in the driver's seat and we think we're driving. And so the first step is to recognize that there are two parts of your mind.
Yeah.
And the unconscious mind is where we store these beliefs, these values, these thoughts, this, what I would call inner dialogue, whether they're empowering beliefs or self-limiting beliefs, because you can see it on both ways. Right. But it's this like, oh, this is how it is. This is where it is. And the first step is to uncover that. And you made a point earlier that I think is very, very important to bring back up, because Jim Quick's a dear friend of mine and he loves the breaks. He had massive brain injuries. And I remember it was probably 14 years ago, he said this to me. He said, you don't realize that you're living the life of everything you consume. Your view of the world was from the music, from the TV shows, from all of it. And he's like, because in his words, your brain or your unconscious mind is a supercomputer that's constantly absorbing everything around you, which is in one direction, driving your conscious mind to make decisions based on the program that's installed in it. Right. And we talk about this with the reticular activating system, right?
Yes,
where if you see something, it's because you have more evidence in your unconscious that that's how it is, instead of evidence to support it in the opposite direction. So for everybody listening to this, even as entrepreneurs, right? Like, when we think about this, some of us became an entrepreneur by choice. Some of us, it kind of fell in our laps. But if we go back 3 years before that, we weren't running around like, oh, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to make 5 figures a year, 6 figures a year, 7 figures a year. There was a belief that had to change in our unconscious mind to align our values and beliefs that it was possible. And then our conscious mind had to make actions, behaviors, and decisions to execute those workouts to bring that identity into place. And so that's how I like to think about it, because to your point, the thing that I see a lot of times is that, and we just hit this like concrete identity, right? Like, who I am is who I am. And it's like, no, what got you here won't get you there. Right.
Yeah.
And it's this understanding that there is no finish line, but it's an invitation. And I think what's so powerful too, and you say this all the time, and you just kind of summarize, is that even when we start to recognize, like, if you're listening to this conversation, you're like, holy moly, my brain's a little bit broken. The default of the conscious mind is to judge the things that we find.
Mm-hmm.
And well, oh my God, like I'm horrible that I see it that way, or that I don't see it that way. But I would submit, and I even matched TJ's language because I submit from him, Mr. Linguistics over here. I would submit that conscious shame cycle deeper roots in the unconscious negative beliefs, instead of, to your point, like accepting what you see, because it brings it into your awareness. And once it's in your awareness, you have a empty road in front of you of like, okay, well, if this is serving me, I can keep this. But if it's
Yeah.
not serving me, I can take intentional actions consciously to try to shift what that is, whether it's in conversations, or
Yeah.
you and I do this in conversations. Like we'll say something and then you'll call me out on it. I'm like, oh, cancel. And I'll say it again, or we'll do it in front of each other of like, oh, there's a better way to see this. And
Well, you even heard me do it earlier. It was like, I want to be careful about how I say this.
yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really important. And one of the things that you just stirred up for me there that I think would be valuable for the audience is to provide like some tangible steps. Cause sometimes these are fascinating conversations, right? For people like you and I that are fortunate enough to have a lot of connections and knowledge and experience in some of these elements in personal growth. But a lot of times when I present this stuff to people, they're like, okay, that's all great. And it resonates with me. Awesome. I'm on board. I have an unconscious mind. Now what?
Well, before you do this, and
Mm-hmm.
I want to make a point every day because I want you to fill this vein in. I also think it's really important because one of the core models that I teach in everything, but also that it took me years to understand, is that the reason change doesn't stick is because we go too quick to the how.
Yeah.
Right. And so the what and the why are important, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
this has come up a few times in this conversation already. So for those listening, I've done a podcast on this, on the 4 stages of competence, or there's training in the Alliance. You can Google it, but it's just the 4 stages of competence. And I'm not going to say the big words, but it's unconsciously incompetent and unconsciously competent and blah, blah, or consciously incompetent, right? But basically the 4 stages of growth as a human is, number 1 is we're unaware, right? Like
You don't know what you don't
you
know.
don't know what we don't know. But the moment you find it, you're aware. That doesn't mean you've solved it or you fixed it. It
Right.
means you're a toddler learning to walk, or the analogy or the simile that I like to use
Mm-hmm.
is when you put shoes on a dog for the first time and watch him walk across the floor.
Yeah.
That's really what it is. But that doesn't happen in awareness. So you go from unaware to aware. And then a lot of people get stuck in that aware because they literally are just like, oh, how? But you have to understand the what and the why without fault and blame and guilt
Mm-hmm.
and shame.
Yeah.
And take it as an opportunity, because after aware, you move into learning. And learning is failing forward. It's walking like a dog with new shoes on across a slippery floor, and like learning to walk like a toddler, but where you're taking this awareness that you had in your unconscious, but you didn't see. Then you have a conversation, or you have a situation happen in a relationship, or even for people listening to this, your business is coasting and then you hit a massive roadblock. And you're like, I didn't see that coming. I didn't see that coming. Well, now that you're aware of it, it doesn't fix it or solve it. But when you look at it objectively and you're like, okay, I can see that. I can see that. I can see how this led me there. Then you move into that learning bucket. And the learning bucket is where you get flexible and you're like, okay, well, what do I do to change this? And you stay in that learning bucket until you are consciously taking actions and behaviors aligned with, to your point, the ideal self that your unconscious mind holds, until it becomes a part of your identity and it doesn't require conscious thought anymore. And then that's when you move into the mastery bucket. And so I think it's important just to understand those things, because I want you to share some tangible takeaways here of like just how to implement these things. But I think everybody tries to skip the step. They'll go from unaware and they're like, oh, I heard this thing that resonated somewhere, but I won't unpack it. So I'm going to go do this habit and behavior. Like think about
Right.
how many people start going to the gym in January, right? And like, I hate going to the gym January 1st through 14th, but on the 15th, the gym's empty again. Right.
Yeah.
Because there was just this, oh, how, but it was lacking the full understanding.
So it lacks the, yes. And it lacks the commitment, if you will, that is required with an identity change. So one of my favorite movies, Hot Tub Time Machine. There's a wonderful moment in the beginning where, Craig Robinson he's the actor, is working at a dog, like a pet store or something.
Yep.
And he's walking this overweight bulldog on this treadmill. And he's like, come on, it's not about losing weight. It's about lifestyle change. And it's such a simple comment, but such a profound statement that's absolutely true. Because what you'll see with the people that go to the gym is like, I want to lose weight. I want to be in shape. I want to have more energy. I want. Instead of saying, I am a gym rat.
Yes.
Or I am in shape. I am this, right? And so that identity shift is where you see significant increases in people that stick to it.
Yep. 1,000%.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention that because I think that's very important.
And to give a reference to everybody, I've referenced this book probably, 100 times on this podcast. But a lot of what TJ and I are talking about, right? TJ's background is NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, which how I would summarize it in layman's terms is the language that you use externally and internally programs your unconscious mind to align your actions and behaviors to bring the results that you desire into your life.
Yeah. So it's the way I break it down, like for an elevator conversation, is just NLP is the roadmap to your mind.
Yeah.
It's the way that the Bander and Grinder, who created it back in the 70s, they wanted to figure out how to duplicate success of others. And so it was a study of patterns to understand those patterns and then be able to implement those patterns in whatever portion of your life that is, such that you can create the effects and the outcomes that are similar to the person that you're copying.
Yeah. So the book that I would recommend, and this is for everybody, it's Benjamin Hardy's book, Personality is Impermanent, right? Because like I was a personal development coach, knew NLP, hypnosis, all of it. And I was almost like overcomplicated for me. And then I read his book and I was like, oh, behavioral psychologist breaking this down into like bite-sized chunks. So I was like, oh yeah, this is it. But to your point, it's that identity piece and that identity shift of in the, PD world, it was like the way that they taught it is like the mistake that most people make is do, be, have, when in actuality it's be, do, have.
Be, do, have. Yeah, right? Exactly.
And so I think before TJ shares some tangible tips in a minute, which his brain doesn't forget these open loops anyway, so it's perfect, is that the big stage is like anywhere in your life where you want something to change, whether it's how you communicate with your team or how you talk to your partner or how you communicate with yourself or the way that you show up in your business or the way that you show up in your life, is to understand that you have two potential drivers in that seat. You have your conscious mind and your unconscious mind. And in the earlier part of this conversation, what I would submit is the easiest way to understand it is that the way that you intentionally use your conscious mind programs your unconscious mind to either work in your benefit or when you ignore it to work in your detriment. And so having an awareness of that is huge. To then have an awareness of those things that you're like, this isn't serving me. I want to be able to change this, which then leads us to some tangible takeaways that you understand like what it is and why it's so important to understand. And then now I'll let you share tips.
So yes, completely agree with everything you said. And I'm going to jump right into it because there's a couple loops I want to close. First of all, there was one other thing that I wanted to add to what the unconscious mind does. And that way I can close that loop. So your unconscious mind cannot process a negative.
I knew you were going to say that because of what I just said to you. Where I was like, because he won't and doesn't forget. I literally knew when it came out of my mouth. I was like, he's about to hit the negative note, and I'm like, I'm going to get called out right now.
Yeah. So I'm glad you said it. No, it was a beautiful segue into this conversation. So here's my proof for this. Once again, your unconscious mind cannot process a negative. Yeah. And that means when you say like, oh, I can't, or I don't, or I'm not this, whatever the blank after that is, your unconscious mind doesn't hear the don't. It doesn't hear the not. It doesn't hear the can't. What it hears is the thing. And the proof for that is actually incredibly simple, right? Yeah. So if I tell you, don't think about a cheetah, immediately everybody listening to this had like a flash at least of a cheetah, right? I don't know what it was doing, but it was a cheetah, right?
I would actually love to know. I wish everybody was here listening to this and I'd be like, what did you see the cheetah doing in that moment?
Yeah, that would be kind of a fun experiment.
We'll have to try that at the next event.
Yeah, we should. That'd be fun. That's a really fun one because what that means is a very simple, tangible thing that people can do is to be aware of how many times we say, I'm not good at math. I can't do this. I don't do this. And those things, when you eliminate that, here's the thing. And I say this intentionally. I don't want to hear what you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to tell me what you are going to do. I want you to tell me what you want. So it's funny. You ask somebody like what their motivation for being successful is. Like, well, I don't want to be broke. Cool. I respect that. Simultaneously, all your unconscious mind heard right there was broke.
I want to be broke.
So don't say it like this. Say, I want to be wealthy. I want to be successful. I want to be rich. I don't care what it is. I'm like, there's the judgment of like, I want to have money. Fine. Like I don't care. It's what you do with it that matters. But my point is, say what you want.
Yeah.
Right. So say it what you want and say it as if you have it already.
Yes.
Right. That's where that fake it till you make it thing actually becomes legitimate.
When
right?
you speak correctly about yourself. Because
Yes.
the two things, because this is how TJ and I talk in person too, by the way, we just keep opening loops and diving deeper down the rabbit hole with each other. The way that concept of negatives was taught to me, and proof in the pudding, but it was a very extreme example, it was back in the personal development days. And they're like, think about this. And the story they gave like really landed. Like, have you ever been around a group of women who are married and they're like, I don't want to get pregnant yet. I don't want to get pregnant yet. I don't want to get pregnant yet. And genuinely within like 6 months, every single one of them is pregnant.
Yeah.
And like the women in the room are like, and like you can see it and you can have it tangible. So the example of the cheetah is a really, really surface example, but the other examples are also deeply powerful as well. And to your point of speaking into the future as if it's already happened and removing the negatives, right? Like you'll hear, I've actually done this on the podcast where I've said something, I'm like, cancel. And I'll say it again in the other way. And you'll notice when TJ and I talk, even when we're together, there's no perfection in this. It's a muscle, but we also hold each other accountable to this. Like I'll call TJ sad, crying, and breakdown, and then he'll listen. And then he so eloquently says, do you want me to just listen or would you like me to check you? I'm like, check me, bro. And he'll check me. And I'm like, oh, got it. Right. And it's the same point of like gratitude and anxiety can't exist at the same time. And so it always reminds me of that. You know, this clip I'm talking about, there's that like 5-year-old girl standing on the bathroom counter, looking in the mirror, like I'm strong. I am powerful. With her dad. Right. Like
beautiful
I am
clip.
blank. I am blank. And there's so much, regardless of your belief in woo-woo, there's so much science around this as well that's been studied. And like, you know, you and I have our opinions about people, but like something Tony Robbins has brought to the world and a lot of other people that have done this. But like, to break it down to what you shared earlier is how you speak about yourself is programming your unconscious to take these actions and behaviors in alignment with that belief.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're speaking to where you currently are, you're stagnant and nothing's going to change. And so speaking as if it's already happened in the future while also speaking into the positive frame to focus on that direction is like the biggest breakthrough. And the negative point is such a small point, but such a profound and powerful concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I like that one, because it's a simple thing to do. And you'll start catching yourself so quickly on how many times you say a negative before something that you genuinely would prefer to eliminate from your life, but it's still present because you're saying you don't want it. So that's the first one, is to pay attention to one's language. The next one I would say, and this is the question you were talking about earlier. So we'll just get into that real quick. My favorite question to ask people, even like checkout people at the store when I'm at like, you know, Target or the grocery store or whatever. Somebody says something that they believe about themselves. You know, my same example, like, oh, I'm not good at math, or like, oh, I can't go to the gym, you know, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I ask this simple question. Oh, when did you decide that? When did you decide that? And so when you're asking yourself, obviously it's when did I decide that? The beautiful thing about this question is it's simple. It's actually an empowering statement, because the presupposition or the assumption of this statement is that you made a decision, right? So what it's telling you unconsciously is that you can make a different decision. So it's actually an emboldening statement, even though it's uncomfortable to maybe ask, because what it's basically saying is yes, you are in charge of your own outcome. And so it's a beautiful question, because there's accusatory statements as well, where, you know, when you ask somebody like, well, how come? Or if you ask somebody why, which is like the worst question in the world, because people can give you basically, you just leave this door open to like anything. I love that question because it gets people to give you a specific answer, and it usually there's a pause.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's uncomfortable enough, it tickles enough, to use the parlance of our relationship, but it tickles enough to get people to think about, oh man, like, did I make a decision? And the reality is the vast majority of the time people will go like, oh, well, this is when I did it. Sometimes we're like, well, I didn't make that decision. And then you can just like, okay, well, what if you did?
Mm-hmm.
Could you make a different one? Right. And so there's a point here, which is that beliefs, which are stronger than decisions, were every single belief you have, right? The belief that the sun is going to come up tomorrow, right? Whatever it is, no matter how strong or how weak that belief is, it was once a decision. All beliefs were decisions. Not all decisions become beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very, very important thing to understand. And so asking that question in any context, when you catch yourself thinking something about yourself that you wish you didn't think about yourself, or that's maybe detrimental to you. Like, I know a lot of entrepreneurs are like, I'm not good with money. Cool. When did you decide that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So whatever that thing may be. And this is also the question that my wife loves to challenge me with, because you start asking people that you love this question, and the first time you do it, they'll be like, oh man, like they might be like, oh, it's really profound. Like, I've never had somebody ask me that before. But then you'll say something and they'll be like, when did you decide that? And you'd be like, shut up. Like,
Yep.
I don't want to hear it, And so it becomes, but it's really, it's a beautiful question. It's very simple and eloquent.
I think the one note I want to add, because I love it, and I'll give you guys my other two on top of that one that I like to use is what are you pretending not to know?
I like it. Yeah,
and then if well, I don't know, I'm like, well, then great. What are you pretending not to see? Right. And those three questions, truthfully, I don't even know if anecdotally is the word, but that's the word that feels called to share. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I like to use words out of context and with wrong definitions all the time. To TJ's point, the most powerful person to ask those to is yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like I have a client that, I've been talking to, and they're like, well, my industry just won't invest in this. Like it's just my industry. And I'm like, well, when did you decide that?
Yeah.
Because what you don't understand, or may not understand, I would submit, is that when you make that declarative statement of that decision, what you're saying is that nothing can be done. No one's figured it out before. Right. There's no action that you can take.
Yeah.
Which deepens the hole that we're currently in. And it's very disempowering because it's just stagnation over and over and over again. And so those questions, and I love watching TJ do this. He does it to me. We do it to each other. He does it to my friends, my partner, everyone in our life. Like this is what, if we go out to dinner, it's game over, because every waiter is going to be sitting down at the table with us.
This is who I am.
Yeah, this is who I am. And truthfully too, and even asking the question, it's who
I choose to be.
It's a line of accountability as well, because half the time I ask it, it tickles me on the inside. And I'm like, oh, got it. Yeah. Right. Like, but I think to your point, the second point that I would make is, and I'm so glad that you said it, why just creates an unlimited rumination bucket.
Yeah, it's so why is effectively a conscious masturbation, because it gives everybody the ability to consciously think.
Yeah.
And so you can create whatever you want. Why am I afraid of spiders? Well, it's because when I was a kid, I had this thing happen, and you're going back to your memories, which, by the way, only exist within your unconscious. So you're going back to memories like, well, I got bitten by one when I was a kid, or like a few of them surrounded me when I was in the shower, and like then this thing happened. My brother put one on me, and it scared me. And like you're like, okay, so these are all reasons to back up a decision that's already made. But what you're not recognizing is that decision is unconscious, and that decision and or belief already exists within you, and you're consciously just finding evidence to back it up. That's cognitive bias. So instead of asking the question of your unconscious, for what purpose am I afraid of spiders? Oh, it's survival, it's safety, it's whatever. But that's a much deeper answer, digging further down to what I call idea bedrock, right? Or unconscious bedrock. And that gives you a much better understanding. So that question of why, it gives a person the ability to just dance around the answer and give meaningless, pointless, trite conversational points. It doesn't actually require, you can reach it, but it doesn't require you to reach it.
No, and I think about like, and I'll make this really cheesy and easy, but if like we go to a restaurant and I'm looking at the menu and I'm like, oh, I don't want to order that. I don't ask why. I'm like, no, I don't like mushrooms. Like I don't spend 45 minutes staring at it and like, well, what if this and what if that, or why did this show up? I'm like, I can just make a decision on that. I don't have to explain why about it over and over and over again. Because the thing, and I'll use myself anecdotally of like gaining and losing 100 pounds 4 or 5 times, right? And navigating and building business and losing business. The only time I ever got stuck is because I was asking why over and over, because it was preventing me from taking a course of action or changing one habit or behavior or moving in a different direction. And like I've had so many people on this podcast talk about success, and their basically summarized definition is that I make decisions way faster and learn lessons way quicker than everybody else. And their job and goal is to try to be able to decide faster and faster and faster and faster, not ruminate on the past. And it's crazy because even when you get into brain stats, so much of our memory is made up because of how much information the unconscious mind processes. And, you know, to share this too, it's like, I have personal experiences, but if you take 5 dudes that were all in the same situation in Afghanistan and ask them what happened, you get 5 completely different stories of the same situation. And none of them are the absolute truth.
Because, well, they're all and you're absolutely right. And a big part of why this happens is because every single one of those 5 individuals has their own, what I call filters system, meaning that the external event that is objectively the same for all 5 of you is processed through all of this information, whether it's your beliefs, your memories, your experiences, your values, your strategies, all these different things that exist within our neurology. Filter that event such that you then create what we call an internal representation or an IR of that event, which affects your emotional state, which affects your physiology, which then affects your behaviors or your actions that go out into the world. So, you know, you see a car wreck and those 5 guys might say like, well, I noticed that the dog, he's a pet lover. So he's like, well, I noticed that the dog was flying around because the dog wasn't harnessed in. We got to address that. And the next guy's like, oh, I'm a car guy. So like, I noticed that the car just folded in half, you know, and like the wheel went bouncing down the road. And then the next guy's like, he's got a family. So he's like, I was worried I thought there might be kids in there. So I was checking to make sure there wasn't, like, whatever it is. And then your point that you say a lot, and I love this, is that if you ask that question 5 times of those 5 people, you'll get 25 different answers. So yeah, it's truly profound how much our neurology affects.
Yeah. That. I heard it was maybe like a year ago. I saw a pastor make a clip and it checked me on why. Cause like I literally have hated the why, because why killed me. Like killed me because I was basically like, everybody's heard me say this before, but instead of picking up a pen to write a new story, I was all consumed with the entire story that had already been written. Right. I was living in the past.
I like that.
Right. Yeah. And then I heard a pastor say this. He's like, do you want to know what Y stands for? And I'm like, what? And he's like, who hurt you?
Yeah.
And I was
love
like,
that. I've heard that.
Oh, got it. And he's like, second question, who helped you? Third question, who healed you? And like, it like literally brake checked me hard. Because to the point, I was like giving texture to why, like giving substance to why. And I was like, oh. And to your point, like, when did I decide that? It was a different vein in, but it was like, oh, why? Well, who hurt you? Because there was some story or narrative. Because the only reason I needed to ask why is because I was afraid to take the next action.
Yeah. The analogy that I love is the bumpers at the bowling alley. Why is putting a blindfold on yourself, having someone spin you around, like spin the tail on the donkey, holding a bowling ball, and then say, all right, hit a strike. And you don't even know which way the lane is, right? When you phrase it differently. So instead of saying, why do you have this belief? Say, what specifically about this belief is the issue, right? So to use the analogy of being at a restaurant, if you ask the waiter, you know, why do you recommend this dish? Like, well, that'll give him a lot of freedom, right? So he's probably not even going to get it remotely down the lane. But if you say, what specifically about this dish do you love? You're like, oh, I love the huckleberry reduction. Like, you know,
we live in Montana. We live in huckleberry country.
Yeah, so. We do. Right. So whatever it is. But my point is, like, that person will generally, it puts the bumpers up, and you're not necessarily going to hit a strike. I'm not saying it solves the issue, but it makes sure that the ball gets down the lane. Right. So the point there being, like, it guarantees you some more specificity. So instead of why, try what specifically, how specifically, when or where specifically, given the context of the information. But those things are far more valuable, and they put those bumpers up and really help you get more information and more accurate, relevant information from whatever the conversation is, whether it's with yourself or with somebody else.
Yeah. And so to take this, because I want to tie some of this together, right? We understand that we have a conscious and an unconscious mind, right? The conscious mind we can intentionally use to program the supercomputer or the operating system
That
of
is the
that
unconscious.
unconscious mind.
Yes, sir.
That is the unconscious. And the quality of the clarity that we get is based on the quality of questions that we ask to find information to take action on, not over ruminate about. And some of those questions are like, when did you decide that? Removing negatives from your language, right? Using gratitude, speaking into those things, right? Because what I love about this conversation is also, and I'll own this all day, is how complicated I made growth and change for so many years. And I've said this publicly that like your level of healing never has to match your level of trauma, right? Like just because you experience something horrible for 20 years doesn't mean it's going to take you 20 years to get better.
Yeah.
It gets better the moment you release it and decide to take a different action. And so you've shared so many like tangible nuggets and takeaways. And even when we talk about that, when you are starting to use your conscious mind intentionally, right? Speaking to your inner voice or your intuition, right? Having conversations with yourself, not judging the answers that you get or the clarity that you get, but learning how to trust it over time. What are some tangible steps, like things that you give your clients, things that you've shared with people? Like I've seen you do this in my event before where they're like, okay, got it. Like I'm aware of this. Like this belief isn't serving me, right? Like what steps do people take to start to actively program their conscious or their unconscious mind?
Yeah. So one of the easiest ones, and to really help validate it for people, is I have my clients do a daily gratitude journal, basically. And it's all it is you text me or, whoever, right? But give yourself some accountability is all I'd say. Like do it with somebody that you love. At least 3 things, whether it's first thing in the morning or at the end of the day, doesn't matter, but make it a routine, make it a habit. Find at least 3 things that you're grateful for from your day. And what that does over time is it allows your reticular activating system, which I'll explain in a moment, to be looking for more evidence of things that you are grateful for. And so the one I always use is when you've gotten a new car, you've probably all of a sudden noticed that car driving around everywhere, right? And so the reason we see this is because of our reticular activating system, which is a fascinating system. And I could spend all day on it. I won't. But the reticular activating system basically decides what data and information coming into your 5 senses it's going to present to you to process consciously. So there was a study in the 70s, Robert Birdwhistle, and they figured out, excuse me, I'm referencing the wrong study, but there was a study in the 70s, I believe from University of Pennsylvania, where they figured out that there's roughly 11 million bits of data that come in through our 5 senses every second. And that's, if you think about all the info that's coming in just through your eyes, stuff that you're not paying attention to, that's pretty profound. Now, I don't know how they quantified it. I'm not going to argue, and that's not the hill I'm going to die on as the number, but the concept again is what's important. Consciously, they say we only process about 126 bits of that 11 million. So we take a dump truck full of toothpicks, if those are the bits of data, and we grab a handful.
Yep.
So we really don't consciously process a lot. And our reticular activating system is our unconscious method and process of choosing which 126 bits of that data we get to consciously process. And so the way that we can influence it is to start telling our unconscious mind what to show us. So the car thing, it wasn't that there weren't, it's not all of a sudden that like to, your Subaru, right? Like it's not that there was a bunch of Subarus driving, there's any more driving around than there were last week. But now that you've got the new thing, suddenly you see them everywhere, and your unconscious mind or your reticular activating system is saying, oh, hey, this is important to you. You've been paying attention to it. So now I'm going to show you that data.
Yep.
So all it is that it's just your filter system.
Yep.
So what I do is I have people do the 3 pieces of gratitude, things they're grateful for every day at the same time. And when you do that over the course of about a week or 2, your unconscious and your reticular activating system start presenting you more things throughout the course of the day that you can be grateful for, because
Yes.
it's now showing you that information.
Yeah.
So it's, and you can do that in all kinds of different ways. If it's not gratitude, maybe, whatever it is, you can do that 3 things at the end of the day. Same thing for, let's say, you want to feel powerful. If you're a man and you're struggling, you want to feel worthy, right? If a lot of people, especially entrepreneurs, struggle with I'm not good enough. Ironically, there's the not thing, but like, because they want to be, not worthy, I'm not good enough. It's basically finding examples of when you do feel that thing, and then getting your reticular activating system over time to present you with more evidence of that decision.
Yeah.
And so that's a relatively easy, simple, tangible way. Now, the key to this is consistency,
Yes.
which is why I suggest accountability buddies, if you will. It's very, very important to be consistent about it, because your unconscious mind is always working, whether you're paying attention to it or not. And so if you're giving it consistent, easy, regular, normal, average, just simple instructions, it's going to follow them.
Yeah. I have a question I've never asked you before, and it just hit me. But before I do that, I want to hit this for everybody. The consistency is the most important part. So if you want to write this down, people overvalue intensity and undervalue consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the consistency multiple times a day, or in that bucket, that makes the progress. Like even in the alliance or with our private clients, like to TJ's point, I have them map out their mind behaviors, their body, their being, and their business. And then they have an accountability group, but there's something tangible and measurable of like posting those and sharing those and celebrating the wins. Because for the reticular activating system people, just to give you some tangible examples, because once you see it, to TJ's point, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
But if you've ever been traveling through the airport, you'll always notice the person who has the same luggage as you, right? Think about how many pieces of luggage you see. And then you're like, God, there's another one. There's another one. There's another one, right? Or women with purses or shoes, or men like clothing. Like I only wear Rob and Dana's clothing because it fits me. But when I'm traveling or where I'm anywhere, I can spot their clothing from like a mile away, right? And I have a pink away suitcase, right? And I've only seen 4 of them. And I own a backpack company called High Speed Daddy. And I catch all of them in the wild because my unconscious mind recognizes it is true for me.
Yeah.
And to your point, I think what's so powerful that a lot of people might not understand, and I didn't, is that I can actively take action that influences what my unconscious mind or my reticular activating system chooses to show to me.
Exactly.
And Kate Perkovic, who's been on the podcast, she has this incredible quote that the obstacle is the opportunity, right? And when we think about that, even in entrepreneurship, I make this joke with people. Like if you're struggling to hit 6 figures consistently, but I grab somebody who does $10 million a year and I bring them into your business, everything that you see as a challenge, they see as an opportunity. They just see it differently based on experience or what they've programmed their mind to look at it for. Like for everyone's like, oh, none of my sales calls are converting. They see that as, oh, my game is over. My life is over. And we're like, well, what's the data? And then you look at the data, you're like, oh, well, you didn't frame this right. You didn't do this, right? So the perspective that you have is dictated by what your unconscious mind is allowing your conscious mind to filter of all of those toothpicks, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's really, really important because it's a muscle and neuroplasticity is real. And the more that you flex it, the more that you practice it, the stronger and stronger it gets. But the one thing I will say very bluntly is if you don't work a muscle out, it atrophies and dies. It requires consistency over and over and over.
You don't get abs by going to the gym and doing a hard workout.
Yeah, in one day.
Yeah. You get abs by going to the gym and doing workouts repeatedly.
Yeah.
And by eating healthy and putting in the work consistently. And that's why one of the things that, and this is a minor side note, but one of the things that I love about, seeing how in shape you are and your level of fitness, it's often that you'll see entrepreneurs that are highly successful that are in good shape. And it's because that consistency is present. Like I'm never surprised when I meet someone who's worth a lot of money that's in really good shape, because you have to do those behaviors and those actions over and over and over and do them consistently. And so that's a huge shift for me on certain things to be consistent with my actions. I mean, I'm working on myself too, man. I wish I had it all figured out.
Well, and I think there's a point there too. Like we even said earlier, there's no finish line in this, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And I think about this from, my faith perspective, right? I think about it from books I've read, like Chop Wood, Carry Water. I think about it from the Stoicism perspective. It doesn't matter what vein you get into it. purpose is created through intentional action every day, there is no finish line, right? Like
Yeah.
the trap I call entrepreneurs out all the time. I'm like, what are you working for? They're like, oh, I want more time, money, and freedom. And I'm like, great, give me your phone for a week. And they like have a heart attack. I'm like, I guess you don't want freedom or
Yeah.
time,
Or
right?
time.
Right.
Yeah.
It's removing it, which leads to my question. And I've never
Mhm.
asked this, but I think about it all the time and I keep forgetting to ask you. So the negative thing, right? Like
Mhm.
I don't want to get pregnant, right? Or don't think of a cheetah. In that lens, how does this break down if I'm like, I'm not worthy, right? Doesn't my
Yeah.
unconscious
Okay.
hear I'm worthy?
Yes. So wonderful question. Um, First of all, there's no black and whites.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure.
I like this rule because in general,
In
it's
general,
very helpful. This is one of those examples of where you can break it down. And I've actually spent a great deal of time thinking about this.
I
So
think
thank you
about
for
this
giving me
all
this.
the time and I keep forgetting for us to talk about it.
So when you hear someone say, I'm not worthy, right? Or when you get the message for yourself, I'm not worthy. We'll just use that one for example. Unconsciously, what you're saying is worthy, right? Now, there's a discrepancy between what I'm saying, and I want to acknowledge it, which is that you don't process the negative, which if we just do that, if we cross out the not, then what we're saying is I'm worthy, right? Well, yes, that's true. Simultaneously, the key word in this sentence is what?
Worthy.
Worthy, right? So the point here is that worthiness or the lack thereof is the focus of this sentence. And this is where the linguistic part of NLP gets really fun for me. So if you take this small sentence, which is 3 words, you basically say, hey, the not doesn't matter. So now we're talking about I'm and worthy. Which is the most important? Well, worthy is the context. I'm is the subject, or the content rather. I'm is the subject. And so what you're doing is worthy is the most important part of that sentence. The unconscious and you consciously you desire what that content is. You desire the worthiness, right? Does that mean you have it just because you say that you're not, or if you remove the not, just because you say that you do? Does it mean that you have that? It may, but not necessarily. It's not a guarantee. So what we're doing is we're saying you are more likely, you are statistically, arguably, faithfully, however you want to put it, like universally more likely to achieve the content or the outcome of worthiness if you say it this way. And when you say, I'm not this thing, just because you're saying I'm not, just because you're hearing worthiness and saying worthiness is, you're unconsciously saying worthiness is important to me, doesn't necessarily mean that you have it, right? Simultaneously, like it didn't mean that you had a cheetah when I told you not to think about a cheetah.
Yeah.
So the existence of that thing is not guaranteed based on the statement. The presence of it within your neurology is the only thing that's guaranteed. And so I'm not worthy means that that person is thinking about their level of worthiness. And whatever it is, my assumption, and that's all it is, and I'm always wrong on a lot of it. I'm wrong a lot on this because I trust my client's unconscious mind is the smartest mind in the room for them, not mine. It's theirs. So trust your unconscious mind because it knows you better than anybody else ever could. So if you think I'm not worthy, what you need to understand first and foremost is that worthiness is very, very important to you currently in the context of whether or not you have it, like regardless of you feeling worthy or feeling unworthy. And so this is one of those outliers where it's like, okay, yes, you're saying if you follow my rule hard and fast and you say, yes, I'm worthy, you remove the not, got it. But suddenly that doesn't mean you're going to feel that. That's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
So it is a challenge to get people to think like that and to accept that reality because it's in conflict, right? But how many things in our lives have one or the other complete polar opposites, right? There's always gray areas.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that's a fascinating question. That's something I've been toying with too, because there's absolutely examples of that. But that's how I am currently rationalizing it and making it make sense, because I trust that content or worthiness is truly the most important part of that statement and that conversation, not necessarily how it's said.
Yeah. So I've been ruminating on this one for like a hot minute and I just genuinely keep forgetting to ask and us to talk about it. Because,
glad you did. Good question.
Yeah, because the way that I've framed it is that, like, to your point, no matter what, it's getting installed in our nervous system, worthiness being important. To the conscious mind, when I say I'm not worthy, but the brain doesn't hear negative, I'm still making a disempowering statement where I'm like, but it's just going to show up, where it's like, if I'm worthy, I'm programming my reticular activating system with gratitude to look for ways in which I can bring worthiness to myself.
Yeah.
Or I can take action to bring worthiness or bring that into the environment. But it is, to your point, it's not black and white. But I would say, as a hard and fast rule, because when we learned this in personal development, if you broke the rule, you were kicked out of the room. And you weren't allowed back in. You paid a lot of money to be here, but they held these lines like you've never imagined. And so you become very, very conscious of your language. And my life drastically changed by just removing it, right? So it's like the 80% rule of like, it applies, and there's some gray area to it. But I think the general sentiment here, and my challenge for everybody, would be to be very, very aware. And to your point earlier with the reticular activating system, once you see, you can't unsee.
Yeah.
And so the funny part of this is that people listening to this right now, throughout your day today, whatever time of day this is, you're going to start catching yourself speaking in negatives. You're going to start catching yourself saying, I can't, or I don't want, and you're, and like, those are, to your point, the invitation for the abs in the gym. Those are the mini workouts.
Yep.
Those are you catch it and you're like, oh, there it is again.
That's one rep.
That's one rep. And like, the more reps that you put in, the faster and faster it happens. And TJ makes fun of me for this irregardless thing, right? But TJ was at the event that this happened. And anecdotally, it's a really good story about even those 4 stages of competence that I noted earlier, where it's unaware, aware, learning, and mastery. And what happened is, we were at my event in Whitefish at Grouse Mountain Lodge. TJ was there. Some of my dear friends were there. And I think it was like day 2. I had said something and I was like, irregardless. And someone's like, you do realize they mean the same thing, right? Regardless and irregardless. And I'm like, no. And I didn't realize I was saying irregardless. And for those listening to the podcast, I'm sure there's hundreds of language patterns I obsessively repeat that is annoying. Let me know so I can fix them, please. But this point came up, and then I did kind of felt like I got thrown under the bus, because I was like, wait, who in here listens to my podcast? And like, everybody's hand went up, and I was like, do I really do this that often? And everybody shoved their hand up. And I was like, you blue falcons, none of you told me. Like, none of you told me. You wait till we're in the event and there's 50 of you in front of me. But I actually used it as a teaching point, because we were talking about the 4 stages of competence. And I was like, well, I was actually unaware, massively unaware that I was doing this. And then I was like, I'm now aware. And so for the rest of the event, I would be speaking and I'd be like, oh, irregardless. I'm like, whoa, wait, cancel. Never mind, regardless. And I would do it out loud.
Yeah.
And then the few times I'd miss it, one of you would be like, and I'm like, oh crap, I missed that one, irregardless. But by the 3rd day, I would be speaking and then I would stop and like, what? And I'm like, oh, I almost said it. Regardless.
Yeah.
Regardless. And then by the end of the event, it was just flowing out naturally in conversation. But I put a compressed amount, like probably 200 reps in 2 days, because I realized how much I said it. But once it was in my awareness, it was really, really easy to flex that muscle and rep. And I think it's a tangible example on how you can utilize this if you're listening in anything in your life, in any bucket, in your language, in your habits, in your behaviors, in your gratitude practice. Like, genuinely, this is the bucket that the more that you do, the more that you win. It's not like, I checked the box today, right? Like, it's even in the biblical sense of like, the more I pray, the more I'm tuned into God, the more I'm tuned into gratitude, the more I see that, like, the more it comes in, the more that you flex it and practice it. And I think it's such an important point. And so there's one last thing I want to hit before we land the plane, because you are so good at this. And this is where you don't even know what I'm going to say, but you're welcome. You're so good at this whole conversation, but also so good at this part. And even in our friendship, this is probably the most powerful lessons that you teach me in how you are and how you operate, in the lens of like friendship, in the lens of communication, the lens of rapport building, and especially in the lens of coaching, is you live in questions and very rarely make statements. And when you make statements, you make them as submissions, not as absolute truth. And I will share this personally, that a lot of people I coach, they love like my directness and they love my point. And even with you as friends, sometimes I'm like, can I just share something? You're like, yeah. And I speak it like an absolute truth. Right. And it lands sometimes. But then I've also very intentionally been working on, Well, if I can see that absolute truth, like just on my perspective, would it be more empowering if I asked them a question to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. So my belief, and this is from what I can tell in the conversations I've had, a widely held belief within therapy and counseling circles as well. I compare it to the movie Inception. It's far more powerful for an idea or a thought or a belief to be achieved or reached genuinely by the individual trying to reach it than it is for them to be presented with it on a silver platter.
Mm-hmm.
And so within my coaching, within my life now at this point, I have absolutely adopted the notion of asking questions. And it can be challenging because that a lot of people, in fact, I'm sure some of you listening probably just had the immediate reaction, like, well, doesn't that mean that you're leading people to a certain, and like the truth of the matter is, yes, I have been guilty of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the goal. The goal is actually to get you to go to where you need to be and to trust your unconscious mind, because I don't know what the answer is for you.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, having done it long enough now, I feel like I can see what it might be, and I'm
because it's patterns.
right. Yeah. So there are things that lead, but who the hell am I to tell you what your issue is? Who am I to tell somebody what, what's going on within your brain and your neurology? So yes, I ask questions and I dig, and it can, honest to God, it can get frustrating at times, because sometimes it's like, you do it long enough, and we're all guilty of this, where it's like you get good at something, you get unconsciously competent at something, to the point where you do it automatically, and then you just expect everyone else to be good at that thing. And it's like, why can't this, and you get frustrated. And so to me, I have to be very careful and conscious to avoid that, because what I'm doing is I'm allowing someone who's at that first stage, like they don't know what they don't know, to suddenly break into that second stage. And that's the most important point, where you go, oh, man, I didn't recognize that was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And allowing that person to reach that on their own, far more profound than having anybody, myself, a therapist, a family member, a friend, whatever. It's far more profound if you, the person, the client, whoever it is, if you say, I feel like I'm not good enough, versus if I go like, yeah, you just think you're not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely more profound. So yes, I ask questions, and then when I do make statements, I offer them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't tell people. I mean, I shouldn't say I don't, because periodically I will. There's a specific reason I do it, which
Mm-hmm.
I won't go into.
No.
But it becomes a tool. And so, as you noticed, and I know you're using the submission thing now, I actually, if I'm honest, I actually stole that from the movie Ted.
Yeah.
Can't love be enough? I mean, I submit that love is enough. And I loved that statement so much that I thought, I'm going to start using that, because it basically was like, here's this belief that I have. Are you willing to accept it?
Mm-hmm.
You're putting yourself out there, you're being vulnerable, and you're also providing the ability for someone to take it and run with it, or take it and reject it. So to me, it belies an incredible amount of confidence in one's belief, in one's self, in one's honest opinion, to be able to put it out there and say, do with it what you will. You have to remove the attachment of them accepting it, and just say like, hey, take it and run with it if you want. And so that way, if I do make a statement, it's like, I submit, I propose, I offer. And those things usually land a lot better. And for anybody that's ever been in a relationship, I would highly recommend you try that, because it certainly helps a lot. Yeah. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. That's been a conscious thing for me.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, and you get to be acknowledged in it too. Because for everybody listening to this, if you ever listen to the breakdown I did on the book, The Catalyst, and if you haven't, shoot me a DM that says customer journey, and I'll send it to you to make it easy. But the number one thing that gets in the way of us being a catalyst for somebody else's change, including our own, is reactance. And reactance is the built-in unconscious mind's anti-defense system,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when you make absolute statements, if they don't 100% come in agreement, then the walls go up. But when you make submissions or use declarative language, it creates space and an invitation for an openness, and not even to mention on the part of the person saying it, to your point, removes attachment and allows you to be present instead of having an agenda or an expectation.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's a really, really powerful concept, and one that I consciously work on all the time. If people are like, oh, you're great at it. I'm like, yeah, but I catch it. Like,
Yeah.
I catch where I have an agenda, or I'm like, God, couldn't you see this? Like, and I just want to like tattoo it into their soul.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, but then what I understand about the brain as well is that when you do that, and I understand this from studying child psychology in the Declarative Language Handbook by Linda Murphy, is that when you make the absolute statements, it goes into a memorization bank, not a feeling bank. And so it's forgotten about. But when you make it in submission or with question, it gives context to that situation and they anchor it in as permanent memory. It's the same with your children as well. So it's a really, really powerful concept. And the reason I asked TJ is because I think all of us, communication is the number one tool to utilize for empowerment, depth, relationships, and connection, both to ourselves, but to other people we work with, our relationships, our teammates, our customers. And the power of it is profound. And all too often, I don't find it talked about enough. It's always actions and behaviors, but so much of it comes down, as Sharon Lecter says, who wrote Outwitting the Devil, is a friend of mine. Our thoughts dictate our words, which dictate our actions. And using questions and using submissions and being aware of these things give us basically an unlimited license of possibility to be able to achieve the goals and the desires that we have, and also help other people do it. But it all boils down to communication. And you shared so many tangible takeaways and tips and nuggets when it comes to communication. And what I would submit at the end of this is that the most important communication that you can have is with the mirror, and how you speak about yourself. Absolutely. And how you communicate with yourself, whether it's your thoughts, whether it's your unconscious mind, whether it's your intuition, is you also have an unlimited dinner plate of practice, because it's you and you. And so anytime it's you and you, that's a rep, that's a muscle, that's a place, and it will start to waterfall out into every other place that you go. But my invitation for everybody would be not to practice this on everybody else and install it in you. It would be to install it in you and let it leak on everybody else.
I love that.
And so obviously TJ is in my ecosystem. He's in the Alliance. He speaks at the events, but he's also on Instagram. And that is the absolute best way. And the one thing I know that lights TJ's bucket up is conversations. And so,
yeah, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah, no, like trust me, like Danny gets mad at me enough. And every time I call TJ, I'm like, hold on, where's Danny? Can you tell her I love her? Can you tell her I'm sorry I'm about to steal all this time? Can you tell her I'll send you home in a little bit of time? Like, loves conversations. And so my ask of everybody here is, if anybody anything landed, if you have any questions, if you're like, want to explore this more, like, please reach out to TJ on Instagram. We'll have it all linked, but what's your Instagram?
TJ Fry 406. Fry is just FRY, no silent E's.
Yeah.
It's just TJ FRY 406 on Instagram.
Yeah. And I'll give you some open loops. Ask him about his career as a basically semi-pro skier or professional race car driver, and understand that he's also speaking from experience when it comes to identity shifting and shifting the results that you have, and actually going through one right now as well. And so
absolutely,
it might be a version 2 since we're neighbors. And I think the next one, though, we got to rip the Starlink and go sit on top of a snowy mountain and do it just for fun.
Yeah, I would absolutely love that, man. Let's make that happen. I think especially in like a cold, snowy environment that's just crisp, clean, and beautiful, we'll set everything up and go do one up there, because it's so stunning here. I feel fortunate we live in a postcard.
I know. I literally realized, like, my coping mechanism, everybody has theirs. Mine is getting in the car with the windows down and just driving around where we live. It's like my time with God, but I'm like, it never gets old. And it genuinely programs me to gratitude every single time.
Yeah.
Including all the shoveling this weekend and the power outage and me going to TJ's house. I'm like, I need wood. I need an axe. Can I chop it at your house because you have light? Because I need to sustain myself over here. But one last question as we land the show, and I knew this would be beefy. So for everybody listening, the one thing that I will say as well is that, a lot of you even listening to this might have been like, holy moly, I have an awareness of this now, or I catch this something now. Understanding this stuff and practicing this stuff is all still a muscle. And if you listen to this episode again, you're going to hear it differently and pick up different nuggets and takeaways. And this would be one of those ones, because it was really a profound masterclass in understanding the conscious, unconscious, even understanding what NLP is without needing to know what it is, but how to apply it and use it to reprogram yourself and to support yourself. And so, like, let this be one of the ones that you focus on. I mean, all of them potentially, but this one really particularly, like, revisit it, like take something from today's episode and put it into practice, and then come revisit this episode again and listen and be like, oh, I noticed something different. I see something different. It would be one of those because it was loaded with depth. And so the last question, because you listen to the podcast sometimes, you don't really have to because we podcast every day in person, is my favorite question is like, everybody here, right? Like, imagine they forgot everything that you talked about, but you have the ability to tattoo any wisdom on their soul. And you don't have to submit this one. You can tattoo it hard. But that they take away with them, that they remember, that they believe to be true about themselves or believe what possibility is. What would your tattoo wisdom for everybody be?
That's a really good one. So many things come to mind, things to do, things to try, whatever, what have you. I think gonna make me choose just one.
Yep.
All right, see, you do a good job. You put me on the spot.
Bumpers, bro.
Bumpers. Yeah, you're nailing it. All right. Here's what I would say. There's a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to your show, and most entrepreneurs, in my experience, are willing to accept responsibility for their own lot in life, which I think is important to any of this being feasible. I'm going to assume that everybody listening to that is aware that they are in charge of their own life. And that being said, once you've made that decision, and that's a belief that you hold, communicate with your unconscious mind. Thank your unconscious mind, because everything that it's doing for you, whether it's positive or negative, is for your own benefit. We evolved, we were created. I believe they're, by the way, not mutually exclusive. Evolution and creationism, I believe, can coexist, and I believe they do. Your unconscious mind is there and was evolved to keep you alive. And therefore, everything it's doing, even the things that cause you struggle, are for your own protection. And the shift that I had when I recognized that and began to thank my unconscious mind for these limiting beliefs or what have you that were holding me back, knowing that it was installed at one point to protect me, to keep me safe and keep me moving forward and keep me alive, shifted everything for me. Because now the rapport, the love, and the gratitude that I have for my unconscious mind is profound. And just communicating that with my unconscious mind, just literally, I'd say it out loud every day. Thank you, unconscious mind. That by itself has given me peace, has given me worth, has given me direction, has given me focus, and has drastically shifted the direction of my life. So yeah, speak with, communicate with, and thank your unconscious mind.
Yeah, I love that. That's a perfect bow to put on this present. Perfect bow. So I'm going to trust my intuition because I feel called to wrap this show a little differently. And so number one is I ask that everybody don't allow this episode to become shelf-help, right? There's things that were landed, things that came into your awareness. And to our point is that now's the perfect time to put a rep in, to put one of these into practice. And there was a lot of tangible nuggets shared. And so I would invite you very, very aggressively to take this on in the lens of I'm responsible for my life and results, which means I'm also empowered to choose anything different and create anything different. And the journey of 1,000 steps always starts with a single one. And so let today be the first one. And then I just want to pray to end today's episode. It feels called on my heart. So dear Lord, I just want to express my deepest gratitudes to you, to TJ, to everybody listening to this, that your message is felt, that this landed and inspired light and change and possibility for people to feel this and step into their power. And I just ask that you continue to touch the lives of everybody listening to this podcast, that you allow this to touch TJ's lives, that you allow the messages to be heard and have the empowerment and the action and the discernment and the love and the energy to take action on these things. And I just ask that you bless everybody listening to this show and you pay this forward for everybody. And in your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. That's beautiful, brother. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Love you. Love you. All right, guys. You'll either see me in the next episode or you'll hear me in your earballs. But either way, we out.